Some women are like moths, drawn to a flame far brighter than they deserve. Tell me, what fortune are you hunting tonight, little moth? The Duke of Alistair's voice was a low, velvet-draped insult, meant to intrigue and provoke the anonymous woman before him. He leaned closer, his own mask of polished obsidian doing nothing to hide the predatory gleam in his eyes. He could not see her face, hidden behind an elaborate creation of silver filigree and midnight blue feathers, but he felt the sudden stillness in her. Lady Annalise absorbed the barb, a sliver of ice in the furnace of her resolve. Little moth, how perfect. He saw a fragile creature attracted to his glittering title, his immense wealth, the very center of society's flame. He had no idea that she was not drawn to the flame. She was the inferno that was about to consume it. The orchestra swelled, a triumphant waltz filling the gilded ballroom, but for her, all sound had ceased. She was intensely aware only of the man before her, the man who had a year ago stood by and watched as her world turned to ash, his silence the final hammer blow that shattered her family's name. Tonight, she would not be shattered. Tonight, she was the hammer. The grand clock began to chime, its deep, resonant tolls counting down the final moments to midnight, the hour of the great unmasking. A ripple of anticipation went through the assembled aristocracy. The Duke's lips curved into a confident smirk. At last, he murmured, his gaze fixed on her mask. The mystery will be solved. He held out his hand, expecting her to take it to be his prize when the masks came off. But she did not move. All around them, lords and ladies were reaching for the ribbons of their own masks, laughter and chatter rising to a fever pitch. But Annalise felt frozen in that moment, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes suddenly upon them, the most intriguing pair of the night. The question hung in the air between them, sharp and heavy as a guillotine's blade. Who was she? He saw a mystery to be conquered, a prize to be won. But as she looked into his arrogant, beautiful face, only one thought echoed in the silent chambers of her heart. How could he not see the ruin he helped create in her eyes? And how could he not know that tonight the moth was here to burn his world to the ground? Her mind recoiled from the glittering ballroom, back to a night steeped in rain and despair, 1 year ago. The transition was so seamless it felt like falling. She was no longer in a dazzling ballroom, but in the dimly lit dining hall of the Beaumont estate, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and betrayal. Viscount Beaumont, a man with a smile as sharp and thin as a shard of glass, had just raised his wine-glass in a toast. To sound investments, he'd declared, his eyes finding her father's across the table, and the unfortunate folly of those who risk what they cannot afford to lose. The words were a public declaration of war. Her father, Baron Croft, a good man but a trusting one, went pale. The whispers started immediately. The Duke of Alistair, who until that moment had been her most ardent suitor, simply sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable, his silence a deafening verdict. He did not defend her father. He did not even look at her. That night her world ended. The news of their ruin was on every tongue in London by dawn. Creditors circled like vultures. Their home, their belongings, their very dignity were stripped away piece by piece. Her father suffered a collapse, his health shattered by the shock and the shame. Annalise, once the darling of the season, became a social pariah overnight. To survive, to pay for her father's care, she sold every last trinket, every gown, every precious memory, until nothing was left but a hollowed-out grief. She took a position as a paid companion to a cantankerous dowager, suffering daily indignities, the silent scorn of servants who once bowed to her, the pitying glances of women who once envied her. And in that crucible of humiliation, a new woman was forged, not of glass, but of tempered steel. The air in Lady Ashworth's drawing-room was a cloying mix of expensive perfume and hypocrisy. Annalise stood rigidly behind the dowager's chair, a piece of human furniture, her hands clasped so tightly that her nails left half-moon indentations in her palms. She was a ghost here, a pale spectre in a serviceable grey dress that mocked her as part of the paid help. The room was a whirl of silk and laughter, a familiar tableau from a life she had been violently ejected from. She recognized every face, every simpering smile, every calculated tilt of a fan. These were the same women who had clamored for her attention, who had invited her to their country estates and praised her wit and beauty. Now their eyes slid over her as if she were a smudge on the air. The dowager, a sharp-boned woman with a disposition as sour as old milk, snapped her fingers without looking back. "My shawl, girl. There's a draft." Annalise moved automatically, fetching the fine paisley shawl and draping it over the thin shoulders, her movements efficient and silent. It was during this task that she overheard her name, or rather the ghost of her name, spoken with a particular venomous glee. Drifting from behind a large, feathery potted fern were the voices of the Duchess of Haverford and the Duchess of Middlebury, two women whose approval she had once naively coveted. Seeking a moment's respite from the weight of being unseen, Annalise retreated a step, the fern's fronds providing a fragile screen. "I simply vanished from sight, my dear," the Duchess of Haverford was saying, her voice a conspiratorial purr. "One must admire the efficiency of it all. One day the toast of the town, the next, poof. A memory, a rather expensive memory for Baron Croft, I'd wager," tittered the Duchess of Middlebury. "Such a fool to be taken in by Beaumont. The man is a shark, everyone knows it. But Croft was always too trusting for his own good. A fatal flaw in a man of business." Annalise's breath hitched. Her father's face, pale and shattered at the Beaumont dinner table, flashed before her eyes. The word folly echoed in her mind, a poisoned dart launched by the Viscount. "And the daughter," Haverford continued, her tone dripping with mock sympathy that was far crueler than outright scorn. "Little Annalise. We all thought she would snag Alistair, didn't we? She had him on a string for a season. But he, of course, is far too clever to be saddled with a penniless baron's daughter and a mountain of her father's debt. He cut her loose without a second glance." "Quite right, too. The penniless baron's daughter," Middlebury repeated, as if savouring the title. "I saw her just the other day, trailing after old Lady Crestmore like a lost puppy. Dressed in that dreadful grey sack. To think she wore French silks from my own Modiste. How the mighty have fallen! Their laughter was like the shattering of fine crystal, sharp, discordant, and utterly without warmth. It was not the laughter of genuine amusement, but of supremacy, of schadenfreude so pure it was a drug. They were not just discussing her ruin. They were relishing it. Each word was a delicate knife, expertly wielded to flay what little remained of her old self. The casual cruelty of it extinguished the last, flickering embers of her grief. The sorrow that had been a constant heavy companion for a year, a shroud she wore beneath her plain dresses, simply evaporated, burned away by the white-hot intensity of this new, clarifying humiliation. It was one thing to be ruined. It was another to be the subject of afternoon entertainment for bored aristocrats. She saw it all with a terrifying clarity. Her father's trust had been a weakness to be exploited. Her family's honor, a commodity to be traded. Her own heart, a frivolity to be discarded. The Duke of Alistair's unreadable face, his deliberate silence, was no longer a source of heartbreak, but of cold, hard understanding. He had not loved her. He had been assessing an investment, and when it devalued, he had sold his shares. The whispers of the duchesses faded into a dull hum. The gilded room, the chattering guests, the petty concerns of this world, it all seemed suddenly small and contemptible. She had been striving for survival, enduring the indignities, swallowing the scorn, all for the sake of paying for the physician's visits and the few comforts she could provide her ailing father. But survival was not enough. It was a meager, shrinking island in a sea of malice. A new desire, cold and sharp and absolute, crystallized within her. It was not a hot, raging fire, but the hardened steel of a finely honed blade. Retribution. The word settled in her soul, not as a wish, but as a purpose. It would not be a dramatic, messy vengeance. That was the way of the hot-headed and the doomed. No, hers would be a patient, meticulous campaign. She would not seek to destroy them with scandal or violence, but to beat them at their own game. They had valued money and status above all else. Then she would acquire both. They had believed her powerless. She would find a power they could not comprehend. They had laughed at the penniless baron's daughter. They would not laugh when she stood among them, not as a supplicant, but as an equal, or, better yet, as a superior. The dowager snapped her fingers again. "Stop dawdling, girl. My tea is cold. Fetch a fresh cup." Annalise turned. Her face was a placid mask, her posture as meek as ever. But as she walked toward the tea service, her movements were different. There was a new grace to them, a purposeful economy of motion that spoke not of defeat, but of gathering strength. She picked up the delicate porcelain cup, her hand steady. The laughter from behind the fern was a spark to the tinder of her resolve. Let them have their tea and their gossip. Their world, which had once been her entire universe, was now merely the battlefield. And Annalise Croft, the girl of glass, was gone. In her place stood a woman of steel, and she was just beginning to learn how to strike. The air in the storage room was thick with the ghosts of forgotten things, a potent mixture of dust, dried lavender, and the faint, sweet decay of old wood. Annalise's arms ached from moving heavy crates and furniture shrouded in white linen, her dress smudged with grime. The dowager's command had been a punishment, a petty exercise in reminding her of her station. But for Annalise, every task, no matter how menial, was now a reconnaissance mission. She noted the room's layout, the quality of the discarded items, the weaknesses in the household's organization. It was while shifting a particularly cumbersome armoire that she noticed the worn leather trunk tucked behind it, nearly swallowed by the deep shadow of the alcove. It was unassuming, scarred by travel and time, its brass fittings dull with tarnish. A faint faded crest was stamped onto its lid, a stylized bird in flight, the Croft family emblem. Her breath hitched. This had belonged to her grandmother, Ilara Croft, a woman spoken of in hushed, dismissive tones as a quiet, eccentric soul who had died when Annalise was just a babe. Driven by a curiosity that felt both sacred and dangerous, she knelt. The lock was rusted shut, but the hinges, weakened by age, yielded to a firm, insistent pressure from a fire iron she'd found nearby. The lid creaked open, releasing a sigh of cedar and old paper. On top lay a few moth-eaten shawls and a small velvet-wrapped case containing a single, simple locket. Beneath them, however, the trunk seemed shallow, its interior depth not matching its outer dimensions. Her fingers, now sensitive to deception, traced the interior lining until they found a slight warp in the wood near the bottom corner. A hidden catch, cleverly disguised as a knot in the grain, yielded to her press. A false bottom lifted away silently. There were no glittering jewels, no bags of gold coin. Instead, she found a stack of ledgers, their black covers worn soft at the edges, and a single sealed letter, her name, Annalise, inscribed upon it in a sharp, elegant script. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the dusty silence. She broke the wax seal, its impression the same flying bird from the trunk. The letter began not with a greeting, but a statement of fact. "My dearest Annalise, if you are reading this, then your father is gone, and you are alone in the house of our enemies. I am sorry for both." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She read on, her eyes devouring the precise, unsentimental script. Her grandmother, Ilara, had not been the quiet, fading flower of family lore. She had been the architect of the Croft family's prosperity, a mind with a preternatural grasp of commerce and investment. While her husband, the public-facing baron, entertained and politicked, Ilara had quietly built a fortune through a network of silent partnerships and shrewd investments. Using a trusted intermediary, a man named Mr. Albright, the family banker. "I feared a day when our success would attract wolves." Ilara's letter continued, "And so I hid the true extent of our wealth, even from your father, a good man but too trusting. The ledgers you hold are the true record. The public books are a fiction." With trembling hands, Annalise opened the topmost ledger. The pages were a labyrinth of numbers and notations, but it was the code key, neatly folded and tucked into the back of the final volume, that unlocked the truth. She cross-referenced entries, her mind, sharpened by hardship, piecing together the pattern. There were regular, large transfers to a shell company, the Ethelred Import Consortium. The dates corresponded with the beginning of her family's financial decline, and the authorized signature, forged with devilish accuracy on the withdrawal orders, was that of her father. But beside each forged entry, in her grandmother's tiny, meticulous hand, was a different notation. Falsified. Albright's hand. For the benefit of Viscount Beaumont, the room seemed to tilt. Viscount Beaumont, her father's closest friend, the man who had presided over the sale of their remaining assets with an air of somber regret. And Albright, the unassuming banker who had tearfully explained the unfortunate market collapses that had wiped them out. It was not misfortune. It was theft, a patient, calculated and utterly ruthless plunder orchestrated by the very men her father had called brothers. They had not just let them fall. They had pushed them, stealing the very ground from beneath their feet to line their own pockets and cover their own fraudulent schemes, likely teetering on the brink of their own collapse. The cold, sharp desire for retribution that had crystallized within her now had a name, a face, and a target. It was no longer an abstract concept. It was a roadmap laid out in ink and paper. The evidence was here irrefutable, a weapon of immense power. The laughter from the dowager's drawing room, the memory of Beaumont's condescending smile, the phantom ache of hunger in her belly, it all fused into a single, white-hot point of focus. She carefully reassembled the trunk, leaving everything exactly as she had found it, except for the ledgers and the letter. These she wrapped in the cleanest linen shroud she could find. Her movements were slow, deliberate, her expression as placid as the surface of a still lake. But beneath the calm, her mind was a forge, heating the steel of her resolve. They had stolen her family's past. She would steal their future, and she would use their own greed, meticulously documented in her grandmother's ledgers, to do it. The woman of steel now held the blueprints to her enemy's fortress. All that remained was to find the chink in their armor and drive the blade home. The discovery did not just transform her, it performed a brutal alchemy, turning the soft lead of grief into something cold, hard, and purposeful. The girl who had wept into her threadbare pillow was gone, her ghost lingering only in the hollows of Annalise's cheeks and the new, unyielding light in her eyes. In her place stood a student of ruin, a cartographer of betrayal. Her days took on a new, clandestine rhythm. While the household slept, she would retreat to the small, forgotten dressing room adjacent to her bedchamber, a space that smelled of dust and quiet decay. Here, by the meager light of a single, carefully shielded candle, she spread her grandmother's legacy across a small escritoire. The initial overwhelming fury had subsided, replaced by a meticulous, almost surgical focus. Her mind, once a sanctuary for the rhythms of Byron and the delicate lines of Botticelli, now bent itself to the brutal poetry of numbers. She cross-referenced the damning coded ledgers with her father's own financial papers, the very records that had, in their innocence, chronicled their own demise. The patterns that emerged were chilling in their clarity. It was not a single brutal strike, but a death by 1,000 carefully administered cuts. A shipment of textiles would be lost at sea just after her father had heavily invested in its insurance, a policy underwritten by a shell company Beaumont had recommended. A promising investment in a colonial trade route would mysteriously collapse due to shifting political winds. Winds, Albright had assured them, were nothing but a favorable breeze. Each transaction, each unfortunate market collapse, was a thread pulled from the tapestry of their fortune, each one secretly woven into the growing wealth of their betrayers. The letter from her grandmother Eloise was not merely a revelation, it was a final posthumous directive. The elegant looping script held a mother's fury and a strategist's cold foresight. "They are vultures, my dear Annalise, but they are clumsy ones. They believe their positions and titles make them untouchable. They have forgotten that money, in the end, is the great equalizer. They have left a trail, and I have documented it. Use it, and then the final key, instructions for accessing an emergency fund. It was not a fortune, but a significant sum, carefully shielded in a private, discreet bank in Geneva, far from the prying eyes and sticky fingers of London's financial elite. It was a war chest. Her grandmother had not just diagnosed the disease. She had provided the means for the cure, however radical it might be. One evening, she stood over her father's sleeping form. The room was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight that cut across his face, etching the lines of sorrow and sickness even deeper. His breathing was a shallow, rattling thing, the sound of a clock winding down. He was a ghost of the vibrant, trusting man he had once been, a man broken by the hands of his friends. The cold resolve within her solidified into a vow, spoken not in a whisper, but in the silent, iron language of her soul. "I will not merely restore our name, Father," she promised the stillness. "I will unmake theirs. I will dismantle the world they built upon our bones, brick by gilded brick." The path forward was no longer an abstract desire for revenge. It was a complex financial campaign. She began to see the London social and economic season not as a gauntlet of humiliation, but as a battlefield. The glittering ballrooms were her intelligence-gathering grounds, the afternoon teas her reconnaissance missions. She needed to re-enter that world, but not as the pitiable Miss Annalise Woodward, the ruined heiress. She needed a new identity, a shield of impeccable reputation and unassailable social standing behind which she could maneuver. Her grandmother's letter had mentioned one last, crucial asset, a distant cousin on the maternal side. A woman of formidable character and unimpeachable social standing who lived in quiet seclusion in the Lake District. A woman, her grandmother had hinted, who understood the weight of family and the sting of betrayal. Annalise penned a carefully worded letter, not revealing the full truth, but suggesting a visit, an appeal to familial duty for a grieving young woman. It was a gamble, but her first calculated move. Weeks turned into a month. Her studies continued. She learned the language of margins and collateral, of short selling and hidden liabilities. She saw how Beaumont and Albright had used her father's impeccable reputation as their own collateral, leveraging his trust to secure loans and investments they could never have obtained on their own. They hadn't just stolen his money. They had cannibalized his honor. The reply from the Lake District came on thick, cream-colored paper, the handwriting bold and decisive. Her cousin, a widow named Mrs. Eleanor Thorne, would be pleased to receive her. She expressed sympathy for her father's illness and suggested a lengthy visit, noting the country air would do them both good. It was an invitation to a fortress, and Annalise accepted without hesitation. Packing was a swift, unemotional affair. She took only what was necessary, along with the linen-shrouded ledgers and her grandmother's letter, which she now knew by heart. As the hired carriage pulled away from the crumbling London townhouse, Annalise did not look back with tears. She looked forward, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The woman of steel was leaving the forge of her discovery, armed with her blueprints, and heading to her first strategic stronghold. The battle for their future and the destruction of her enemy's past had begun. The carriage ride north was a study in contrasts. The grimy, soot-stained streets of London gradually gave way to the lush, overwhelming green of the countryside. Annalise saw the pastoral beauty not as a source of peace, but as a map for the figures and names occupying her mind. The linen-shrouded ledgers a palpable weight in her trunk, heavier than all her other possessions combined. She was leaving Annalise, the grieving daughter, in the dust of the London road. In her place, a new persona was being forged in the quiet of the coach, one born of necessity and cold fury. Upon arriving in the bustling market town of Keswick, the final leg of her journey, she did not proceed directly to Mrs. Thorne's estate. Instead, she enacted the first part of a plan conceived during the long miles. At a respectable inn, she secured a room for a single night. The following morning, she emerged not as Annalise, but as Mrs. Blackwood, a somber, discreet widow of modest means. The transformation was achieved with a dark, unadorned dress, a veil that obscured the determined set of her jaw, and a manner of speaking that was both polite and terminally reserved. Using a portion of her carefully guarded funds, she secured lodgings in a quiet, respectable boarding house run by a Mrs. Higgins, a woman whose curiosity was as vast as her girth. "Lost your husband to the sea, did you, Mrs. Blackwood?" Mrs. Higgins had asked, her eyes gleaming with unsated gossip. "To a fever, ma'am," Annalise had replied, her voice a soft, colourless thing. The city air did not agree with his constitution. "I was advised to seek the tranquility of the lakes." It was a plausible story, woven with just enough truth to be believable. From this unassuming base of operations, her silent investigation began. Keswick was not London, but it was a hub for the local gentry and merchants, many of whom had ties to or interests in the larger financial currents of the capital. She took to frequenting a particular coffee house near the town's modest exchange, a place favoured by factors, solicitors, and the more ambitious local businessmen. It was a world of dark wood, the rich scent of coffee and tobacco, and the low, earnest hum of money. She was a ghost at the feast of commerce. Seated in a corner, a single cup of coffee growing cold before her, she would pretend to be engrossed in a book of poetry, while her entire being was focused on the conversations swirling around her. She learned to decipher the local code. A mention of the West Indies venture was no longer an abstract concept. It was a thread she could trace back to the ledgers, to the Beaumont's noted investments in sugar and rum. She heard the names of ships, the Perseverance, the Kingston Merchant, and committed them to memory, cross-referencing them later with the notes her father had scrawled in the margins about insurance rates and cargo manifests. Her grandmother's ledgers were her Rosetta Stone, the dry columns of numbers and the cryptic notations: B&A collateral against convoy the Brisevin, high risk, high yield, came alive when paired with the boasts and anxieties of the men in the coffee house. She learned that Beaumont and Albright were not just thieves. They were gamblers, their success built on a precarious house of cards, and she began to see the keystone of their current vulnerability. It was a massive, over-leveraged investment in a single shipping convoy from the colonies. The Carolina Venture, as it was called, was the talk of the coffee house for a week. Two men, their voices lowered but carrying the sharp tone of insider knowledge, discussed it at the table next to her. "Beaumont's gone all in, I hear," one said, a man with ink-stained fingers. "Every shilling he could borrow, and then some, is riding on those 7 ships. A bold move," his companion replied, sipping his coffee. "The Spanish coast is still treacherous, and the weather reports from the Atlantic are uncertain. If even 2 ships are lost, the insurance won't cover the leverage. It would be a catastrophic loss, catastrophic for some. An opportunity for others," the first man said, with a knowing smile. Annalise's blood ran cold, then hot. This was it. This was the flaw in their armour, the single thread which, if pulled, could unravel the entire tapestry of their deceit. They hadn't just stolen her father's money. They had used his good name to secure the loans for this very gamble. His honour was the collateral on their recklessness. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it stole her breath for a moment. They had not only ruined him, but had positioned him to take the public blame should their gamble fail. She returned to her lodgings that evening, the poetry book clutched tightly in her hand. Mrs. Higgins commented on her pallor, assuming it was a fresh wave of widow's grief. Annalise merely nodded, retreating to the silence of her room. She unfolded a clean sheet of paper and began to write, not as Mrs. Blackwood, but as herself. It was a letter to a shipping agent in London, a man her father had once mentioned as scrupulously honest. She inquired, as a concerned daughter of a former investor, about the general safety of transatlantic routes, mentioning the Carolina Venture by name as an example of the kind of enterprise that worried her. It was a harmless-seeming letter, a feather's touch, but it was a start. She was no longer just listening. She was probing, testing the strength of the enemy's wall. The woman of steel had found her first target, and the quiet click of the lock on her writing desk was the sound of a cannon being loaded. The reply from the London shipping agent arrived a week later, a crisp, formal letter that confirmed everything Annalise had overheard. The Carolina venture was a high-risk, high-reward enterprise, its success hinging on a swift, unseasonable crossing. The agent's tone was polite, but carried an undercurrent of professional disdain. Such ventures, he implied, were for men who gambled with fortunes they could not afford to lose. Annalise folded the letter, the paper crisp beneath her fingers. It was a start, but it was not enough. She needed someone who could translate the whispers of men in clubs into cold, hard evidence, someone who knew the legal architecture the Beaumonts had so skillfully perverted. She needed Mr. Finch. Finding him required more subterfuge. Her father's old address book, a relic she had saved from the wreckage of their estate, listed a residence in Bloomsbury. A discreet inquiry at a nearby bakery revealed the truth. The Finch family had been forced to sell the house some years prior and had moved to a less fashionable, indeed almost obscure, set of rooms in Clerkenwell. The building, when she found it, was a testament to a fallen professional class. The stone steps were worn, the brass knocker dull with neglect. She knocked, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The woman who answered was careworn, her eyes holding a permanent sadness. But they sharpened with recognition at the name Annalise Lockhart. "He doesn't see many visitors," Mrs. Finch said, her voice soft, with a grief that seemed woven into its very texture. The disappointment. It aged him more than the years. "Please," Annalise said, her own voice barely a whisper. "Tell him it's about the Beaumonts, and that I have the ledgers." The name Beaumont acted like a key. A few moments later, she was ushered into a small, book-lined study that smelled of dust and old paper. Mr. Finch sat in a worn leather chair, a rug over his knees. The sharp, intelligent man she remembered from her childhood was still there, but he was buried under layers of defeat. His posture slumped, his hands, once so precise and commanding, now resting limply on the arms of his chair. "Miss Lockhart," he said, his voice a dry rustle, "you look so like your mother. Forgive me for not rising." "Mr. Finch," she began, her throat tight. She dispensed with the Widow Blackwood pretense. This man deserved the truth. She told him everything, the overheard conversation at the soirée, the insurance leverage, the use of her father's name as collateral for their recklessness. As she spoke, a faint light began to kindle in his weary eyes. Finally, she placed the leather-bound ledgers on the small table beside him. "This is what they took from my father's study. This is how they did it." For a long moment, Mr. Finch simply looked at the books as if they were a ghost. Then, with a tremor in his hand, he reached out and drew one onto his lap. He opened it, his thin, blue-veined fingers tracing the columns of figures, the coded entries, the deliberate obfuscations. Annalise watched as the past decade seemed to fall away from him. His spine straightened, his breathing deepened. The rustle in his voice was replaced by the clear, analytical tone of the brilliant solicitor he had once been. "The dual entry system," he murmured, his finger tapping a specific sequence of numbers. "I suspected it. I told your father it was a possibility, but the records were always just out of reach. They were always one step ahead." He looked up at her, his gaze now sharp and focused. This is the proof. This entry here," he pointed, "this is the transfer to a shell company in the Netherlands. And this is the initial loan for the Carolina venture, guaranteed by your father's holdings and his signature, which they must have forged after they had control." He closed the ledger with a soft, definitive thud. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet room. The air of defeat was gone, replaced by a simmering, righteous anger. "They did not just steal his money, my dear. They stole his legacy, his honor, and they used the law as their weapon. They made a mockery of the very institutions I dedicated my life to upholding." He looked at Annalise, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a grieving daughter, but as an ally. "What is it you intend to do?" "I intend to ruin them," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering, "as completely as they ruined my father. But I do not wish to simply throw a rock through their window. I want to dismantle their house, brick by brick, until the roof falls in on their heads." A slow, grim smile touched Mr. Finch's lips. It was the first genuine expression she had seen on his face since she arrived. "Then you have come to the right place. Revenge is a dish best served cold, they say, but justice requires a precise recipe. You have the fire, Miss Lockhart. I have the map." From that moment, he became her secret general, conducting his campaign from the worn leather chair. He schooled her in the language of finance and the nuances of corporate law. He identified which clerks in which offices could be trusted, which were in the Beaumont's pocket, and which could be swayed by a combination of coin and conscience. He tempered her fury, channeling it into strategy. "Patience," he would counsel. "They are powerful men. A direct assault will fail. We must find the weakest point in the foundation and apply pressure. Steadily, silently, he guided her hand as she composed more letters, this time to banking associates in Amsterdam, inquiries framed with such specific knowledge that they could only come from someone who had seen the internal records. He helped her cross-reference the ledger entries with public shipping manifests, building a shadow ledger of her own that laid bare the entire precarious scheme. Anneliese left Clerkenwell each time feeling as though she had been armed anew. The woman of steel now had a master smith, honing her edge, teaching her the exact angle of attack. The quiet click of the lock on her writing desk was no longer just the loading of a cannon. It was the sound of a key turning in a complex mechanism, each turn bringing her closer to the moment the whole deceitful edifice would come crashing down. She had found more than an ally in Mr. Finch. She had found the one man who could show her how to make her revenge a thing of terrible, beautiful, and irrevocable legality. The air in Mr. Finch's study, thick with the scent of old paper and drying ink, had become the atmosphere in which Anneliese learned to breathe a new, sharper air. Under his tutelage, the world of finance transformed from an impenetrable fortress into a city of interconnected alleys and vulnerable gates, each with a keeper who had a price. Her first move was not born of the dramatic flourish she had once imagined, but of a chess player's quiet, opening gambit. Finch laid it out for her with the calm precision of a surgeon describing an incision. The Beaumont convoy, the venture's pride, is heavily leveraged. Its profitability hinges on a delicate timetable and predictable costs. We will introduce a tremor, nothing more. A tremor, however, in the exact spot to make the entire structure hum with unease. He provided her with a list of names, men in shipping offices, minor functionaries in Lloyd's Coffee House, brokers who asked no questions and valued discretion above all. These were the anonymous cogs through which she would apply pressure. Using a portion of her carefully guarded capital, Anneliese, through this ghostly network, executed a series of transactions so subtle they were virtually invisible. She did not short Beaumont's company's stock directly. That would have been a declaration of war. Instead, she made targeted purchases in the shares of smaller, competing trade routes, a nudge that shifted the market's center of gravity by a fraction of a degree. More crucially, she orchestrated the sale of insurance derivatives linked specifically to the Caribbean route the venture's pride was scheduled to traverse. The sales were small, scattered, and designed to suggest a whisper of doubt, a flicker of insider knowledge too minor for most to notice, but impossible for the actuaries and underwriters to completely ignore. The effect was a work of financial poetry. A week later, in his opulent office overlooking the Thames, Sir Reginald Beaumont felt the pinch as a man feels a sudden cold draught in a sealed room. A report from his comptroller noted a sudden, inexplicable rise in the insurance premiums for the venture's pride. Simultaneously, his port agent in Bristol wrote of new and temporary administrative fees and unexpected delays in securing the most favorable berths. The numbers were not catastrophic, but they were anomalous. They nibbled at the margins. "Market volatility," Beaumont grumbled to his junior partner, tossing the papers onto his polished mahogany desk. "The damned Spaniards are causing trouble again, or the weather patterns are spooking the insurers." "It will pass," He was a man who understood brute force, hostile takeovers, political strong-arming, the crushing weight of debt. This was different. This was like being slowly, meticulously drained of blood by 1,000 pinpricks. There was no enemy to confront, no rival company making a bold move. The very air seemed to have turned against him, the impersonal mechanisms of commerce twisting in a way that felt, for the first time, personally inconvenient. He never suspected an invisible hand. How could he? The woman he had ruined was a socialite, a decorative creature of ballrooms and drawing rooms. The concept of Annalise Lockhart, understanding the esoteric language of maritime insurance derivatives, was as ludicrous as a canary studying artillery manuals. Meanwhile, in Clerkenwell, Annalise received the news from Finch. He had a way of conveying success without a trace of celebration. "The premiums have increased by 15%, he stated, his fingers steepled. "The port fees have added nearly £200 in unforeseen costs. The foundation, as predicted, has a hairline fracture." A fierce, quiet joy bloomed in Annalise's chest. It was colder and sharper than any emotion she had ever felt, a sensation of pure, undiluted potency. This was not the hot, messy satisfaction of a slap or a screamed accusation. This was the clean, surgical thrill of a plan perfectly executed. She had reached across London from the silence of her bedroom and the anonymity of a broker's note, and she had made the mighty Reginald Beaumont flinch. "What is the next step?" she asked, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly with adrenaline. Finch allowed himself a thin ghost of a smile. It was the expression of a master watching his most promising student solve a complex equation. "Now we observe. We let him dismiss it. We allow him to absorb the minor loss and bury his unease under arrogance and business as usual. A man who believes he has weathered a random storm lets his guard down. And that," he said, picking up a fresh sheet of paper, "is when we introduce the second tremor. This time, we will not target his convoy's expenses. We will begin to question its very existence." Annalise left his study that day, feeling the weight of the ledger in her mind, the shadow ledger they were building together. Each entry, each cross-referenced manifest and decoded transaction was another brick removed from the wall of Beaumont's legitimacy. The click of the lock on her writing desk was no longer just the sound of a key. It was the sound of a clockwork beast being wound, its gears turning with silent, inexorable purpose. She had drawn first blood, not with a sword, but with a stock ticker, and the taste was more intoxicating than she had ever dreamed. The news of Beaumont's reaction, delivered by Finch with the dry relish of a botanist noting a particularly predictable plant's growth, only solidified Annalise's resolve. The Viscount was a creature of pure, unadulterated instinct, a bull that saw every flicker of red as a challenge to charge. His borrowing was not a sign of weakness, but of profound, weaponized stupidity. It was exactly what they had hoped for. "He is building his own gallows," Annalise murmured, tracing the rim of her teacup. The china was thin, delicate, a stark contrast to the brutal machinery of their design. "And handing us the rope," Finch agreed from his chair by the fire. "His association with the Duke of Alastair is the linchpin. By boasting of it, he has made the Duke's fortune a visible, tangible part of his scheme. We must now make the scheme itself visible." This was the heart of the second tremor. It was no longer about hidden costs or fractured foundations. It was about narrative. In the world of high finance, perception was a currency more valuable than gold, and trust was its fragile mint. Finch's plan was to stage a run on that trust, not with a mob at the gates, but with a carefully placed question in the right ear. The instrument of this tremor was a man named Silas Croft, the editor of the London Clarion, a financial gazette read with religious fervour by every man of means from Threadneedle Street to Mayfair. Croft was a weasel of a man, but a weasel with an impeccable nose for the scent of blood in the water. He was also, as Finch revealed with a carefully unfolded letter, deeply in debt to a shadowy holding company that Annalise now knew was one of Finch's many faceless creations. The meeting was arranged not in an office, but in the fog-shrouded expanse of Hyde Park at dawn. Annalise watched from a distance, disguised in the severe dark wool of a governess, her face half hidden by a bonnet. She saw Finch, a tall, still figure amidst the swirling grey, and the smaller, fidgeting Croft, who accepted a sealed envelope with a nervous bird-like twitch of his head. No money changed hands. The currency was information and the promise of future leniency. 2 days later, the tremor hit. It was not an earthquake, but a subtle, unsettling shift in the financial bedrock. The London Clarion ran a piece on its second page, tucked between shipping news and commodity prices. The headline was innocuous: on the viability of New World convoys in a saturated market. It was a dry academic piece, full of speculative figures and cautious language. But nestled within its third paragraph was the poison dart. While the enthusiasm of certain prominent peers for such ventures is noted, one must question the long-term stability of enterprises that rely so heavily on leveraged capital. The recent quiet withdrawal of Lloyd's backing from the Odyssey venture, a project famously championed by Viscount Reginald Beaumont and, it is rumoured, supported by the deep pockets of the Duke of Alistair, suggests a more cautious approach may be warranted by smaller investors. Prudence, after all, is the better part of profit. The article was a masterpiece of insinuation. It never accused Beaumont of fraud. It merely stated facts, the leverage, Lloyd's withdrawal, and connected them to the Duke's name in a way that sparked alarm. It was the question Finch had promised, whispered not in a club, but printed in indelible ink. Annalise read the paper in the morning light of her sitting room, the print sharp and black. She felt a different kind of thrill now, colder and more spreading than the first. This was not the joy of a single clean strike, but the grim satisfaction of watching a toxin enter the bloodstream of a reputation. She could almost hear the whispers starting, the subtle recalibration of social calculus in drawing rooms across the city. The Duke of Alistair's name was not one to be bandied about in connection with risk. That evening, a note arrived from Finch containing only a single line: "The patient feels a chill." The reaction was not long in coming. Viscount Beaumont, blinded by his own arrogance, responded not with caution but with aggression. He saw the article not as a warning, but as a personal insult, a challenge to his prestige. He borrowed even more heavily to cover the unexpected costs and to project an image of unshakable confidence, convinced his final, grandiose payout would erase all debts and silence all critics. He heard the whispers, of course. In the hushed corners of his club, men spoke of Mrs. Blackwood, a new, shrewd player in the market who was quietly acquiring shares in the very trade routes Beaumont sought to dominate. But he dismissed them as irrelevant, the chatter of jealous men and the manoeuvres of a bored widow with money to burn. His vision was too grand, his destiny too manifest to be troubled by such gnats. At White's, surrounded by sycophants and the anxiously invested, he bellowed his defiance. "Croft, a scribbler with ink for blood. He knows nothing. The Duke of Alistair," he would say, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial rumble that carried across the room, "has seen the ledgers himself. He is not merely a backer. He is to be my primary partner in the venture's profits. His fortune is woven into the very fabric of the enterprise. Each boast was another nail. He was cementing the Duke's financial entanglement in his fraudulent enterprise, binding the older, more respected man's fate to his own sinking ship. He believed he was displaying an unbreakable alliance. In reality, he was constructing a larger, more tempting target. Annalise, from her silent perch in society, watched it all. She saw the doubt in the eyes of lesser investors, the forced joviality of Beaumont's companions, the way the Duke's name, once a shield, was now being used as a bludgeon. The second tremor had done its work. The foundation had not just cracked. The ground itself had become unstable, and Annalise knew the third act would not be a tremor, but the collapse. The air in Annalise's study was thick with the scent of ink and anticipation. Spread across her mahogany desk was not a lady's correspondence, but a battlefield map of financial ruin. Finch, his usual stoicism replaced by a grim intensity, laid another document before her. "This is the final one, my lady," he said, his voice low. The sworn affidavit from the harbour-master in Lisbon. It confirms the Aurora's hull was compromised in a storm off the Cape. She limped into port, her holds half empty, her timbers weeping seawater. Beaumont's flagship vessel is a floating coffin, and his unprecedented cargo of spices is a myth. Annalise picked up the paper, her fingers tracing the official seal. This was the linchpin. Beaumont's entire scheme relied on the imminent triumphant arrival of his convoy. Without it, his house of cards had no roof, no walls, only a crumbling foundation of lies. "And the Duke?" she asked, her eyes never leaving the damning words. "His solicitors are growing restless," Finch replied, a hint of satisfaction in his tone. "They've made discreet inquiries. They sense the shift in the wind. Beaumont has been using His Grace's name as collateral for his most recent, most desperate loans. The entanglement is now complete. When Beaumont falls, the Duke will be pulled into the crater. They worked with the cold precision of master clockmakers, assembling a timepiece designed to explode at the stroke of midnight. Finch prepared a portfolio more devastating than any sword, not just the harbour-master's affidavit, but falsified customs declarations, letters from abandoned business partners in the East Indies, and a meticulously reconstructed ledger showing the siphoning of investor funds to pay off older, more aggressive creditors. He also drafted legal injunctions, freezing orders for Beaumont's assets, and sent carefully worded letters to officials at the Bank of England and the London Exchange, alerting them to be on standby for a significant market correction. These men would be guests at the ball, their presence now a function of Annalise's design. While Finch wove the legal net, Annalise prepared her own armor. She visited a modiste so exclusive, she operated from a private townhouse in Mayfair, using the last of her carefully husbanded funds to commission a gown that was a declaration of war in silk and thread. It was a deep, nocturnal blue, the color of a sky just before it surrenders to absolute darkness. Tiny silver stars, each one a sliver of polished moonstone, were embroidered across the bodice and skirt, catching the light with a cold, distant fire. It was a gown meant for a queen of the night, not a wallflower. Her final acquisition was her mask. It was not the flamboyant plumage or gilded leather favored by the ton, but a thing of cool, polished silver shaped to cover the upper half of her face. It was featureless, but for the narrow slits for her eyes, which gave nothing away. It was anonymous, imposing, and utterly unforgettable. An invitation to the Blackwood Masquerade, the season's most anticipated event, where identities were playthings and secrets were currency, was secured not for Mrs. Annalise, but for a distant, reclusive cousin of the host family, visiting from the Scottish moors, a phantom guest for a phantom fortune. On the eve of the ball, she stood before her tall looking-glass. The woman reflected there was a stranger, a spectre of elegant vengeance. The silver mask erased her softness, leaving only the sharp, intelligent line of her jaw and the unsettling intensity of her gaze. The star-strewn gown seemed to drink the light from the room. She was no longer the silent observer, the overlooked widow. She was the architect of a reckoning. Finch entered, holding the slim, leather-bound portfolio. "It is done, my lady," he said, his voice filled with an uncharacteristic gravity. "The documents are arranged for maximum effect. A presentation of his fraud, from inception to this very day." She took the portfolio. It was heavier than it looked, dense with the weight of ruined lives and shattered pride. And our audience? All confirmed. The investors, the creditors, the Duke's men, and the Duke himself. They will all be there. Beaumont's own boasting has ensured it. He plans to make his grand announcement at the height of the festivities. A slow, cold smile touched Annalise's lips, invisible behind the silver mask. Then we must not disappoint him. She slipped the portfolio into a velvet drawstring. bag that matched her gown, a hidden weapon against the gaiety of the ball. As her carriage rattled towards the Blackwood estate, she felt a profound stillness settle within her. The whispers of the past months, the careful plans, the second tremors she had engineered, they had all led to this night. Beaumont, in his arrogance, saw the masquerade as his stage, a place to be crowned the king of commerce. He believed the masks would hide the avarice in the eyes of his guests, the skepticism of his peers. He did not understand that the anonymity of the masquerade was a double-edged sword. It was also the perfect camouflage for a predator. He would be surrounded by his sycophants, buoyed by his own lies, waiting for the moment to unveil his greatest deception, the successful voyage and his unbreakable partnership with the Duke of Alistair. He thought he was at the pinnacle of his power. Annalise knew better. He was not on a peak, he was on a precipice, and she was the gust of wind that would decide his fall. The trap was not just set, it was baited with his own hubris, and he was walking into it with a triumphant smile. The third act was about to begin. The grand ballroom of the Blackwood estate was a symphony of decadence, a whirl of jewel-toned silks and swirling black coats set against the gilded opulence of the age. 1,000 candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, their light glinting off the sequins of masks and the polished marble floor. Laughter, sharp and bright as breaking glass, mingled with the soaring strains of a string quartet. It was a world of illusion, where identities were fluid and intentions hidden behind velvet and feathers. She entered not as a guest, but as an apparition. Her gown was the color of a midnight sky, a deep, unadorned velvet that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. The silver mask covering the upper half of her face was a work of art, shaped like the delicate wings of a butterfly, yet its cool, metallic sheen gave it a predatory air. Where other women fluttered and chirped, she moved with a glacial grace, a silence that carved a path through the cacophony. Her poise was not that of a woman seeking attention, but of one who commanded it simply by existing within her own orbit. It was this very stillness that caught the eye of the host, Lord Blackwood, a man who prided himself on collecting rare and beautiful things. He extricated himself from a cluster of fawning dowagers and approached her. His curiosity piqued. "My lady," he said, bowing slightly, "your mask is formidable. I do not believe I have had the pleasure." A voice, low and melodious, emerged from behind the silver. "The pleasure is all mine, my lord. Your home provides a magnificent stage for tonight's performances." The words were a simple compliment, yet they carried an undertone of something else, a knowing intelligence that set them apart from the simpering pleasantries he had endured all evening. They spoke briefly of art and commerce, and with each measured response he found himself more captivated. This was no empty-headed debutante. This was a woman who understood the machinery of the world. And the Duke of Alistair, standing nearby with a glass of champagne he had no intention of drinking, was of the same mind. He had been watching her. From the moment she appeared at the top of the grand staircase, a stark silhouette against the riot of colour. He was a man accustomed to being the centre of gravity in any room, his title and fortune a magnetic force. Yet this woman seemed utterly indifferent to his presence. It was an anomaly he could not ignore. When Lord Blackwood was called away, the Duke saw his opportunity. He approached her as one might approach a skittish deer, though he sensed nothing skittish about her. "A rare creature prefers the shadows at such a vibrant gathering," he began, his tone carefully neutral. She turned her head slowly, and he was struck by the intensity of her gaze. Her eyes, the only part of her face visible, were a shade of deep grey, like the sea before a storm. They did not flirt or fawn, they assessed. "The shadows often provide the clearest view of the light, Your Grace," she replied. The use of his title, unannounced and unasked for, was a subtle power play that did not escape him. Thus began his pursuit. He, the most eligible and powerful man in the room, found himself trailing a phantom. He secured a dance, and as they moved across the floor, her steps were perfect, her form impeccable, yet she felt 1,000 miles away. He asked oblique questions about her family, her interests, her reasons for attending. Her answers were elegant deflections, woven with threads of wit and a profound, almost unsettling understanding of his own world. Shipping lanes, colonial trade, the very foundations of his wealth. She spoke of the fragility of reputation, how a single misstep could unravel a legacy built over generations. Each word felt like a key, turning in a lock deep within him, stirring memories he kept tightly chained. He was obsessed. The other women, with their transparent charms and calculated smiles, faded into a dull background. She was a siren's call, a riddle he was desperate to solve. He needed to see the face behind the mask, to possess the secret she so carefully guarded. He guided her towards a secluded alcove draped in heavy velvet, a relative pocket of quiet away from the music. The air was thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine from the gardens beyond the open terrace doors. "You speak in riddles, my lady," he said, his voice a low murmur, the frustration of the chase beginning to bleed through his aristocratic composure. "You know a great deal about me, it seems, yet you offer nothing of yourself. It is a most unequal exchange." She looked past him, towards the glittering crowd where Silas Beaumont was holding court, his laughter too loud, his gestures too broad. "Some stories are not meant for polite conversation, Your Grace. Some are written in the ledgers of forgotten debts and in the echoes of old insults." The phrase "old insults" landed with the precision of a surgeon's blade. A flicker of something, irritation, defensiveness, crossed his features. He was a duke. His life was a string of forgotten slights and dismissed inferiors. Who was this woman to hint at such things? His patience, worn thin by intrigue and champagne, finally snapped. The carefully constructed facade of the charming nobleman crumbled, revealing the arrogant core beneath. He took a step closer. His height and presence meant to intimidate. "Enough of this game. This cryptic air may enchant the easily impressed, but I see it for what it is, a performance." His eyes, usually heavy with boredom, now glittered with a cold, dismissive light. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper meant for her alone. "Remove the mask. Let us see if the face matches the theatre. Or are you merely a little moth, desperately trying to mimic the majesty of a butterfly before you are? Scorched by the flame?" The words hung in the air, cruel and final. For a single, suspended moment, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The music faded, the laughter died. The universe of secrets in her eyes did not flinch. Instead, a profound and terrifying stillness settled within their stormy depths. The lure had been cast, the hook set deep. He had just confronted his own past, and he was too blind, too arrogant, to recognize the face of his own destruction staring back at him. A cold, crystalline clarity descended upon her as the Duke's venomous whisper faded into the charged air between them. The insult, meant to flay and diminish, did not land as a wound. Instead, it settled into the prepared grooves of her soul, like a final, essential component of a complex machine clicking into place. She felt no pain, only the grim, humming satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. His words were not an insult, but a prophecy in reverse, spoken by a man too arrogant to read his own doom in the script he so carelessly delivered. A little moth, desperately trying to mimic the majesty of a butterfly. The metaphor was so perfectly, pathetically his. It spoke of a worldview where beauty and worth were his to bestow, where the only roles for others were to orbit his brilliant flame. He saw himself as the sun, the center of this gilded universe. He did not understand that she was not a moth, but the coming night itself, vast and inevitable, and her wings were not meant for pretty fluttering, but to eclipse his light entirely. She let the silence stretch, a deliberate, weaponized pause. Her gaze, which he had accused of holding universes of secrets, did not waver from his. The profound stillness within her was not emptiness, but a reservoir of frozen purpose. She saw the flicker of impatience in his cold eyes, the expectation of tears, of stammered defenses. He was waiting for the theater to conclude with his preferred finale, her humiliation. Instead, a slow, enigmatic smile touched her lips, a curve of such chilling serenity that it finally, truly, gave him pause. It was not the reaction of a social climber put in her place. It was the look of a player who had just been dealt the winning card. "You speak of masks, Your Grace," she said, her voice a low, carrying murmur that somehow cut through the distant strains of the waltz. It was not the whisper of a victim, but the calm statement of a judge. "You are right to. This entire evening has been a masquerade, but you have mistaken the players. You see the painted faces and assume you know the performance." She took a single, deliberate step forward, not away from his intimidating presence, but into it. The move was so unexpected that he instinctively leaned back a fraction. "You believe this?" She gestured with a slight, elegant turn of her wrist, encompassing the glittering ballroom, the champagne, the opulent lie of it all. "Is the real world. You believe your title, your land, your bloodline are the unshakable pillars of your existence." Her smile widened, a flash of something sharp and predatory. "They are the mask, and you are about to witness what happens when it is ripped away." His arrogance, which had been his shield, now became his cage. He scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "More theatrics. You think to frighten me with vague threats. I'm a duke of the realm. You are nothing." "I am the echo," she replied, her eyes locking with his, and for the first time he saw past the stormy grey to the absolute, unyielding certainty beneath. "I'm the forgotten debt, now called due. You spoke of old insults, Your Grace. You were so quick to dismiss them, to place yourself above the memory. But some memories have teeth. Some debts are paid not in coin, but in ruin." His possessive stance, the way his body had angled to dominate the space around her, now seemed foolish. A king posturing on a throne that was already crumbling beneath him. It filled her with a cold, triumphant power. Every condescending word he had ever spoken to her, every glance that had stripped her of her history and reduced her to an intriguing object, had been another brick laid in the path that led to this precise moment. And then it began. The first chime of the grand clock at the head of the ballroom struck, its deep, resonant tone cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Bong! The Duke's eyes flickered towards the sound, a minor irritation. But she did not look away from him. She watched his face, a connoisseur of a long-awaited vintage, waiting for the flavor of his own destruction to dawn on him. Bong! A ripple went through the crowd near the main entrance. A sudden hush, followed by a wave of agitated whispers that spread outwards like a crack racing through ice. Silas Beaumont's booming laughter, which had been a constant grating soundtrack, ceased abruptly. Bong! The Duke's attention was fully torn from her now, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion, and the first faint stirrings of alarm. He was a man who was used to controlling the rhythm of his world, and the rhythm was breaking. "What is the meaning of this?" He muttered more to himself than to her. Bong! "It is the sound of midnight, Your Grace," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion, save for a flat, final truth. "You were so concerned with the mask on my face, you failed to notice the one you wore was about to shatter." Bong! Figures moved at the edges of the crowd, not the colourful silks of the guests, but the stark, authoritative black of constables, their presence an ugly stain on the pristine canvas of the ball. They were flanked by a man she knew well, her solicitor, Mr. Albright, his face a mask of grim resolution, a sheaf of official documents clutched in his hand. Bong, the Duke, finally saw them. She saw the exact moment his arrogance fractured. His head snapped back towards her, his eyes wide, the cold glitter replaced by a dawning, horrified comprehension. The pieces were connecting in his mind. Her cryptic words, her lack of fear, her talk of debts and ledgers. He was not confronting an upstart. He was facing a reckoning. "Bong, who are you?" He breathed, the question a desperate, ragged thing. The commanding Duke was gone, replaced by a man staring into an abyss he had not known was there. The final chime faded into a dead silence. The music had stopped. Every eye in the ballroom was fixed on the scene unfolding at its center. She leaned forward now, mirroring his earlier act of intimacy, her voice a whisper that carried the weight of a verdict. "I am the daughter of Baron Croft, the man you ruined to build your fortune, the man whose name you stole, whose legacy you buried in lies and forged documents." She let the words hang, let them sink into him like poison. "My father was the Baron, and tonight, Your Grace, his story is no longer forgotten. It is written on the warrant for your arrest." A silence, thick and suffocating as a shroud, fell upon the ballroom. The final, resonant bong of the midnight chime seemed to have stolen the very air, leaving the glittering assembly frozen in a tableau of suspended animation. All eyes, wide with a mixture of shock and morbid fascination, were riveted on the two figures at the heart of the storm. The Duke, his face a ghastly pale mask of collapsing pride, and the woman who had just dismantled his world with a whisper. It was into this dead calm that the doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a crash that echoed like a gunshot. The spell was broken and 100 heads swiveled in unison. There, silhouetted against the torchlit hallway, stood Mr. Finch. He was not the unassuming clerk they might have expected. His posture was ramrod straight, his face etched with a severe resolve, and he was flanked by 6 officers of the Crown, their uniforms a stark, intimidating splash of authority against the pastel fripperies of the ball. The Duke of Alistair did not see them. His entire being was focused on Annalise, on the name that still hung between them like a spectre, Alistair Vane. His hand, which had been reaching for her mask, trembled in the air, forgotten. "A lie," he rasped, but the words had no strength, no conviction. They were the last desperate defense of a man who already knew the battle was lost. It was then that Annalise moved. With a deliberate, unhurried grace, her fingers went to the silk ribbons at the back of her head. She did not look away from him, her gaze holding his with an unnerving serenity. She untied the knots, and with a soft rustle, removed the silver-winged mask herself. She let it drop to the floor where it lay like a fallen star. The collective gasp that rippled through the room was a living thing, a wave of sound that washed over them. The face revealed was not one of meek submission or hidden deformity, but one of sharp, intelligent beauty, her eyes blazing with a cold, righteous fire. "Behold the phantom, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and carrying. Unmasked! Simultaneously, Mr. Finch and his contingent began their march through the parted crowd. The sea of silks and velvets retreated before them, creating a path of hushed whispers and panicked glances. At the center of the floor, Viscount Beaumont, who had been preening and preparing for his grand announcement, stood utterly bewildered, his mouth opening and closing like a stranded fish. The moment he had orchestrated for his own glorification had been usurped by a drama far beyond his comprehension. "What is the meaning of this?" Beaumont finally managed to sputter, his voice reedy with indignation. "This is a private affair." "You have no right." "I have every right, my lord," Mr. Finch's voice rang out, cutting through the Viscount's protestations with the sharp, clean authority of a blade. He did not break his stride until he stood before the stunned nobleman. From within his coat, he produced a sheaf of official documents, holding them aloft for all to see. "By the power vested in me by the Crown, I am here to execute warrants for the arrest of Viscount Robert Beaumont, the Duke of Westmere and their principal associates, on charges of mass fraud, conspiracy, and the systematic embezzlement of public and private funds over the course of a decade." He turned slightly. his gaze sweeping the crowd, ensuring every lord and lady understood the gravity of the scene. The scheme was built on a foundation of lies, using a network of forged shipping manifests and manipulated ledgers to fabricate fortunes from phantom trade routes. He gestured to the leather-bound journal Annalise had given him, which one of the officers now held. The true accounts, meticulously kept by Alistair Vane before his unfortunate demise, tell a very different story, a story of theft on a monumental scale. The revelation of the crime was a shockwave, but the revelation of Annalise's identity was the thunderclap that followed. As the implications of Mr. Finch's words settled, a new understanding dawned on the faces in the crowd. Whispers of Alistair Vane and the daughter snaked through the room. They looked at the young woman standing so fearlessly before the broken duke, and they saw not an upstart, but an avenging angel. She was the living proof, the ghost of the man they had ruined, returned to settle the ledger. The duke finally found his voice, a raw, broken thing. Vane was a fool, a reckless dreamer. His failure was his own doing. Annalise took a single step forward, and the room held its breath. "His only failure was trusting you," she said, her voice low but piercing. "You did not just take his money, you took his name. You buried his honor and built your gilded palace upon the grave. But the dead do not stay buried forever, your grace, and some debts," she added, her eyes flicking to the constables now moving to surround him and a ashen-faced Beaumont, "are paid not in gold but in justice." The officers moved in, their hands firm on the arms of the two most powerful men in the room. The duke's shoulders slumped, the final vestige of his arrogance evaporating as the cold reality of the iron grips on his arms registered. He was no longer a duke staring down an insolent girl. He was a common criminal being led to the dock. The mask was off, and beneath it was nothing but a hollow, terrified man. As the constables began to escort the arrested men through the stunned, silent crowd, Annalise did not watch them go. She stood alone in the center of the ballroom floor, a solitary figure amidst the wreckage of a society. She bent down and picked up her fallen mask, her fingers tracing the outline of its silver wings. It was not a symbol of hiding anymore, but of a flight completed, a long and arduous journey finally at its end. Around her, the beautiful, fragile world of the Ton had cracked open, and through the fissures, the truth had finally poured in. A strange silence descended upon the ballroom, thick and heavy as a burial shroud. It was broken only by the receding footsteps of the constables and the choked, guttural sobs of Lady Beatrice Beaumont, who had collapsed into a velvet-upholstered chair, her face buried in her hands. The beautiful gilded cage had been shattered, and the occupants were only now realizing they had been prisoners all along. Annalise did not look at the weeping woman, nor at the retreating backs of the Duke and Lord Beaumont. Her gaze was fixed on the silver mask in her hands. The delicate filigree felt cool against her skin, a tangible anchor in a world that had just been upended. The whispers began then, a hissing tide of shock and speculation that washed over the assembled Ton. They were not looking at the disgraced Duke anymore. All eyes were on her, the solitary figure standing amidst the ruins of their collective illusion. It was Mr. Finch, ever the steady hand in a storm, who stepped into the void of her silence. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the cavernous room. "If I may have your attention," he began, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. He unrolled a parchment, its wax seal already broken, a testament to the private revelations that had preceded this public execution. In the matter of the late Dowager Viscountess Cresma's estate, a supplementary will, previously suppressed by the machinations of the Duke of Westmere and Lord Beaumont, has now been authenticated and entered into probate. He paused, letting the implications settle. The name Cresmore was a ghost in its own right, a title thought extinct, its fortune dissolved. The will stipulates that the entirety of the Crestmore holdings, including all capital, properties, and investments wrongfully seized and subsequently managed by the Westmere and Beaumont concerns, are hereby bequeathed to the deceased Viscount's direct descendant, his granddaughter, Annalise Croft, now recognized as the rightful heir to the Crestmoor title and fortune. He adjusted his spectacles, his eyes scanning the crowd, ensuring every soul understood the magnitude of the pronouncement. With the immediate freezing of the Beaumonts' assets and the subsequent collapse of their financial empire, the transfer is effective immediately. With the power vested in this document, Miss Annalise is not only cleared of all false debts and accusations, but is now the sole proprietress of the reconstituted Crestmoor fortune. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept the room. It was one thing to witness a downfall. It was another to witness a phoenix rise from the ashes with such breathtaking, brutal speed. The Crestmoor fortune, once a legend, was now a reality, and it was anchored in the young woman who had just orchestrated the ruin of two of England's most powerful men. She didn't just reclaim her standing, she eclipsed it entirely. In the space of minutes, she had gone from a disgraced nobody to one of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals in the empire, her newfound status built upon the grave of her enemy's hubris. Annalise finally lifted her head, her fingers closing around the mask. She did not smile in triumph. There was no vindictive gleam in her eyes, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. The victory tasted not of champagne, but of dust and old tears. She saw the faces staring back at her, not with the contempt of an hour ago, but with a new, calculating awe. They were already reassessing, realigning their social constellations with her as the new, brilliant and terrifying North Star. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, and the crowd parted for her as if she were royalty. Her gaze swept over them, meeting the eyes of those who had shunned her, those who had whispered behind their fans, those who had seen her as a pawn. She was a queen now, but her kingdom was a graveyard of reputations, and her crown was forged from reclaimed justice. "The House," she said, her voice quiet yet carrying to every corner. It was not the voice of a girl, but of a woman who had stared into the abyss and found her own reflection. "The Crestmoor townhouse on Grosvenor Square. I will be taking residence there immediately." It was not a request. It was a decree. The townhouse that had been her family's, then lost, then absorbed into the Beaumont portfolio, was now hers again. It was the physical manifestation of her reclamation. Mr. Finch gave a curt nod. "It is already being prepared for you, my lady." The use of the title was instinctive, a recognition of her new, unassailable position. As she moved towards the grand entrance, the whispers now held a different tone, deferential, fearful, laced with a desperate curiosity. She ignored them. The grand ballroom, with its shattered chandelier light and its lingering scent of perfume and betrayal, was already part of her past. She had walked in as a ghost, seeking resolution. She was leaving as a force of nature. Outside, the cool night air was a balm. A simple, unadorned carriage, Finch's not one of the gilded monstrosities belonging to the guests, waited for her. She paused at the door, looking back at the Westmere mansion one last time. The light still blazed, the music was forever stilled, and inside, the beautiful people were left to pick through the wreckage of their own complacency. She climbed into the carriage, the silver mask still clutched in her hand. She set it on the seat beside her, a relic of a war she had won. As the carriage pulled away, jolting into motion, she leaned her head back against the leather upholstery and closed her eyes. The ledger was settled. The ghost was laid to rest. But as the wheels clattered over the cobblestones, carrying her toward a home she had never known, a new and more disquieting thought began to form. Power had been won. The question that remained, echoing in the new silence of her soul, was what she would now become. The grand exodus of the Beaumonts was a spectacle of exquisite humiliation. Lord Beaumont's face was a mottled purple, his wife's a ghastly white as they were shepherded through the gawking, silent crowd by a pair of stoic footmen who had, until an hour ago, been serving them champagne. Their son, the vapid Julian, trailed behind, his expression one of bewildered petulance, as if he'd been disqualified from a game whose rules he'd never bothered to learn. Annalise watched from her vantage point near the shattered remains of the chandelier, its fractured crystals glinting like fallen stars around her feet. She did not smile. She simply observed a queen watching traitors be expelled from her newly claimed kingdom. The ledger, she thought, its pages now crisp and clean, the ink finally dry. As the doors closed on their disgrace, the collective attention of the room, hesitant and fearful, shifted to her. And then it shifted to the man standing as if rooted to the marble floor, a dozen paces away. The Duke of Alistair was a study in ruin. The charming, effortless grace that had once been his hallmark was gone, replaced by a palsied stillness. The color had drained from his face, leaving a sickly, waxen pallor. His eyes, those famous blue eyes that had once gazed upon her with such tender condescension, were now wide with a dawning, horrifying comprehension. It was not merely the understanding that she was the anonymous heiress who had bested him, nor that she had orchestrated this very public downfall. It was the slow, sickening unspooling of every interaction, every patronizing kindness, every time he had dismissed the quiet, observant girl at the edge of the ballroom. He saw now the intelligence he had mistaken for simplicity, the strength he had mistaken for pliability, the profound depth of the person he had so carelessly discarded for a prettier, emptier prize. The shame was a physical sickness in his gut, but it was eclipsed by a profound, terrifying awe. This was not the woman he had jilted. This was a force of retribution, and he had positioned himself directly in its path. He took a single, stumbling step toward her, his hand lifting slightly from his side, as if to ward off a blow, or perhaps to beseech. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. What words could possibly bridge the chasm he had dug with his own hands? An apology? An explanation? They would be less than dust. Annalise met his gaze. Her own eyes, once soft with love for him, were now the color of a winter sky just before a storm. She did not narrow them in hatred. She did not widen them in triumph. She simply looked at him, and in that look she communicated everything. His regret was irrelevant. His shame was inconsequential. His very existence was a footnote in the story of her reclamation. He was a ghost from a past life, and she had just exorcised him. The victory was so complete, so absolute, that his presence within it was a form of clutter. He was, to her, utterly and completely irrelevant. She held his gaze for a single, endless second, a lifetime of shared history and bitter betrayal condensed into a silent, final judgment. Then, with a grace that was more devastating than any outburst of fury, she turned her back on him. It was the ultimate dismissal. He was not worth another moment of her attention, not even the energy it would take to voice a curse. The act of turning away severed the last frayed thread between them more definitively than any legal document or public scandal ever could. He was left standing there, a monument to his own folly, the weight of her indifference crushing him more thoroughly than her hatred ever could have. Her focus shifted entirely to the small, trembling figure being guided toward her by the ever-efficient Mr. Finch. Her father, Baron Croft, he had arrived in the carriage behind hers, too fragile for the initial confrontation, but summoned by Finch to witness its conclusion. The old man's face was a river of tears, his shoulders shaking with the force of his sobs. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were the tears of a man who had carried the weight of a tombstone for a decade, only to see it lifted by a miracle. "Papa," Annalise said, her voice softening, the steel in it replaced by a gentle warmth. She stepped forward, her gown whispering against the floor, and took his gnarled hands in her own. "Lisa," he choked out, his voice cracking. "The house, our name. I never dreamed—" "It is done," she murmured, drawing him into a careful embrace. She could feel the delicate bird bones of his frame through his worn coat. "It is all returned to us. We are free of them." He wept against her shoulder, his tears soaking into the expensive silk of her gown, a garment paid for with the ruins of their enemy's fortune. It was a fitting baptism, Mr. Finch stood a respectful distance away, his face an impassive mask, though a slight softening around his eyes betrayed his satisfaction. Annalise held her father, her hand gently patting his back, her own emotions a complex churning sea. There was joy, yes, a fierce and blazing satisfaction at this long-awaited justice. But as she looked over her father's shoulder at the grand, hollow room, at the stunned aristocrats, beginning to slink away like scolded children, she felt the weight of the mask she still held in her hand. The war was over. The ghost of the wronged girl was laid to rest. But in her place stood a woman of immense, unchallenged power, standing on the precipice of a future she had fought for, but had never had the luxury to imagine. The question echoed again, louder now in the quiet aftermath, a whisper that was somehow more deafening than the crash of the chandelier. What does one become after the revolution is won? She had her title, her wealth, her home. But the woman who had clawed her way back to this point, who was she now? The answer was a vast, silent emptiness, and it stretched before her, more daunting than any battle she had yet faced. The grand salon of the Crestma townhouse hummed with a different energy than the ballroom of her reclaimed estate. That had been a theatre of vengeance. This was a stage for influence. The air, thick with the scent of beeswax and hothouse lilies, was laced with the quiet, potent currency of ideas and alliances. And at its centre was Lady Annalise Crestma. 6 months had not softened her, but they had polished the sharp edges into a formidable grace. Dressed in a deceptively simple gown of deep emerald, she held court not from a throne, but from a high-backed chair, a circle of politicians, philosophers, and the newly curious aristocracy hanging on her every measured word. She was the toast of London, a title earned not through beauty, though she possessed a stark, arresting elegance, but through the sheer, undeniable force of her intellect and the shadow of her reclaimed power. Her father, the Viscount, was a testament to her success. His frame, once so fragile, had filled out, his back was straight, and the light had returned to his eyes. He stood across the room, discussing agricultural reform with a fervor that spoke of a man reborn, his honor not just restored, but burnished to a brilliant shine. Annalise watched him for a moment, a sliver of genuine warmth piercing the complex armor of her composure. This was what she had fought for, this peace, this restoration. And yet, the quiet hum of the salon, the respectful deference in every glance sent her way, felt like a different kind of cage. The war was over, but the administration of the peace was a perpetual draining campaign. The mask of the avenging ghost was gone, replaced by the mask of the brilliant, untouchable lady. Both were heavy in their own way. It was then that she saw him. The Duke of Alistair stood at the periphery of her circle, waiting. He did not push his way forward, nor did he wear the foppish, entitled air she remembered. The intervening months had stripped him of that. He looked older, the lines on his face etched not by laughter but by a hard-won humility. When the conversation naturally lulled, he stepped forward, and the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere was palpable. Conversations dipped, glances were exchanged. This was the moment the gossips had been waiting for. "Lady Croft," he said, his voice low and devoid of its former theatrical resonance. "Might I beg a moment of your time?" She offered a slight, neutral nod and gestured to a slightly more secluded alcove framed by heavy velvet drapes. They moved away from the crowd, the noise of the salon fading to a distant murmur. He did not sit, nor did she. He stood before her, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze steady but devoid of any demand. "I will not insult you with excuses," he began, the words clear and deliberate, as if rehearsed and then stripped of all artifice. "Nor will I burden you with pleas for a forgiveness I have not earned. My blindness was a choice. I saw a story that was convenient, a narrative that flattered my own sense of nobility, and I clung to it. I failed to see the person standing before me. I failed to see the truth." Annalise listened, her expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet shame that was not performative but deeply felt. This was not the man who had dismissed her with a condescending smile. This was a man who had been broken against the rocks of his own failings and had, somehow, begun to reassemble himself. "I am here for one reason only," he continued, his gaze dropping for a moment to his own hands before meeting hers again. "To acknowledge my failure to you and to the memory of our former friendship, and to ask for nothing but the chance, however impossibly slim, to one day prove myself worthy of knowing the incredible woman I was too foolish to see." The silence that followed was absolute. In it, Annalise heard the echo of her own question from 6 months prior, the one that had haunted the hollow victory. What does one become after the revolution is won? Here was a new variable, an unexpected equation. Love? The concept felt foreign, a relic from a life that had been stolen from her. It was a luxury for women who had not had to forge themselves in fire and vengeance. It implied a vulnerability she had sworn to never again display. Yet as she studied the Duke, the genuine humility, the lack of manipulation, the quiet strength it took to stand before the woman you had wronged and offer no defense, she felt a fissure in the vast, silent emptiness of her future. This was not a demand. It was an offering, placed at her feet with no expectation of it being picked up. The power, as it had been for months now, was entirely, unequivocally hers. She did not smile. She did not soften. But her voice, when she finally spoke, was not ice. It was consideration. It was assessment. "Acknowledgement is a beginning," she said, her words measured. "Not a conclusion." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not hope, but a profound respect for her refusal to offer easy absolution. "I understand," he replied, giving a short, respectful bow of his head. "The future is a country I am only now learning to map, Your Grace," she continued, her gaze sweeping past him to the salon, to her father, to the life she had built from ruins. "I travel it on my own terms, as you should," he said. Always, he did not press further. With another slight bow, he turned and melted back into the crowd, leaving her alone in the alcove. Annalise stood perfectly still, the ghost of his words lingering in the air. The question of who she was now remained, but the emptiness before her no longer seemed entirely featureless. It held a path, a single tentative thread leading into an uncharted wilderness. And for the first time since the chandelier had fallen, the prospect of the unknown did not feel like a void to be feared, but a territory to be explored, entirely on her own terms.